Welcome back to the afternoon session. I would like to briefly introduce Professor David Holmberg to chair this session. David Holmberg is someone who doesn't really need an introduction. He is known to to anyone who works in Himalaya, for his work, especially his scholarship that focuses on Nepal, but really connects to larger debates and discourse related to culture, rituals, and development issues. So I'm really delighted and thankful to Professor Holmberg for agreeing to chair this session. It's up to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashok Gurung, very much for being the inspiration and energy behind the organization of this conference, along with my old friend Toby Volkman and the Henry Luce Foundation, who have also been quite instrumental in putting all of this together. And I learned today it's a several-year project with all kinds of interesting research, as well as discussions happening in a variety of different contexts. The first panel this morning brought us in empirically into the whole question of everyday religion and and everyday practices and how they relate to things we could call environmental. I must admit that as I was listening to the papers this morning, I was frantically writing down notes myself on little things that were coming to mind, because it turns out I'm talking about around religion and environment at the conference that immediately succeeds this one in Yale, and hadn't really thought systematically about any of this before, and so it's given me a great opportunity to try to think systematically about it. With that said, we're going to move from this kind of empirical zone, these very interesting studies that were reported on this morning from different areas of the Himalayas across China, India, and Nepal Himalayas. And we're going to move to loftier intellectual realms, I guess, and discussions of concepts and debates, which is a nice, vague, I'm sure, category that will include a lot of interesting stuff from various directions. But to start with, we're going to be hearing specifically from Advantages. Many of the panelists this morning were apologizing for not being in religious studies or thinking about religion from a religious studies kind of perspective. The first paper today is Mark Larrimore here at the New School, and he just told me the only position in religious studies. So, Mark, without further ado, it's yours.
Thank you. So I'll add my thanks for all who've made this thing possible. And I guess not everyone here realizes this is the coming to fruition of a 3-year project that began with a large gathering of many people who were here in Godavari outside of Kathmandu in October of 2010, continued through a number of visits by individuals and groups to North India. I went to Gangtok and to Darjeeling in January of last year. And then there was a meeting in Shangri-La in Yunnan in June of last year. So a number of us have been seeing each other and have been meeting each other in a number of different settings. So in some ways it's natural to return and finish here in New York, and in other ways it's supremely odd. And I say this as the person who Ashok introduced as the person who knew nothing about the Himalaya when the project began, and has had his mind stretched in all sorts of ways, and I hope stretched in ways comparable to the ways in which we asked our local researchers to stretch their research methods and their engagement with things by taking on this undefined, amorphous category called everyday religion. And I'll say that at our first meeting in Godavari, many people, all of whom protested that they weren't in religious studies and didn't know how to talk about religion, they all loved the category of everyday religion. So part of the adventure of this for me has been seeing many different people in many different ways take this category that somehow through that weird modifier, everyday, lets them see things or name things or think through things that earlier they had not found they could. I'm not sure we're finished with this project yet, so this is my progress report of where I find myself in thinking about this. So I want to propose a model which one might take. I'm thinking about especially the kind of research projects we heard about this morning for how one might reframe research on religion and the environment in a way attentive to what the many things that we're calling everyday religion. The model is one I would never have come to but for the project. It deliberately eschews religious language. So I'm calling it resource use decisions. This is not because I think that religious phenomena are ultimately secular in nature, or that it is the task of scholars or activists to perform this translation. I think the nature of religious experiences and practices is shortchanged by explicitly secular frameworks, but I also think that's true about most ways of talking about religion, as Pankaj sort of pointed out in his response this morning. Standard models of religion obscure how religion is lived, and especially where it's lived. My hope is that we'll gain a more useful knowledge if we learn to stretch our thinking about resources, about uses, and about decisions beyond a narrowly secular set of assumptions. My thinking here is inspired by efforts of several decades within the field of religious studies and kindred disciplines. The category of religion has been shown to be dangerously narrow in purview, as you've probably heard, modern, Western, Protestant. Its apparently pluralistic extension, the world religions, turns out to be a little better and possibly worse. I'm drawing in particular on a movement called lived religion, which turns the study of religion gently on its head. It focuses on religion as people actually do and imagine it in the circumstances of their everyday lives, in the words of Robert Orsi, our major theorist. It recognizes ordinary people as fully competent moral agents. It understands their ways of integrating religious and other concerns in their lives and the lives of their communities to be a site of genuinely religious creativity. Religious text specialists and dedicated places, what we've generally studied and conceived of as religion, are very important, but they take on a different significance if we foreground the everyday. The everyday is not without its problems as a category and as an object of study, but it is here that religion lives, and here that environments could be sustained. So in what follows, I've written a paper where I can stop whenever the card goes up. I'll give you as many as I can fit of an account of resource use decisions, and then quick overviews of the study of lived religion, and then the common idea of religion, which it helps us move beyond. These will of necessity be abbreviated if delivered at all, but I want to give you enough to persuade you that the old models are problematic, and problematic enough that we can't simply ignore them. We really need to have another way of thinking about how to approach religion, or we'll be bedeviled again in the ways which Pankaj suggested by an inheritance that we want not to carry on. So, resource use decisions. The starting assumption of resource use decisions is that human projects of all kinds require resources. This was news to me. It's not news to you, it was news to me. I'm a theorist of religion. These resources, are generally limited, often shared, and usually require cultivation. Therefore, decisions have to be made about how the use and distribution of these resources is to be implemented. Our focus on the everyday lives of ordinary people means that we expect religious practices, however we describe them, to be braided with other kinds of practices, however we define those. To share limited time and space, or maybe to compete for limited time and space, people, wealth, energy. We get a better sense of religion as it's lived from this everyday scene than assuming that religion lives quintessentially outside of the ordinary and is in a kind of permanent tension with it. Tensions exist, but these are better understood as continuous with the resource use decisions of everyday life. A resource is a thing you can do other things with. Not much can be done without them, including not much in religion. Here I'm resisting the fantasy that religion can or should somehow have no footprint in non-religious life. It's not accidental but essential to religion that it do so. A resource should not be understood in ways, resources should be understood in ways attentive not only to natural and human resources, but also to sacred ones. Water is a resource, as you heard in all of our accounts today, but water comes in many different kinds. Some of them are religious, some of them are other kinds. Chocopani, for example, isn't just water. So among resources, I would invite us to include water of various kinds, but also the sacred energies of mountains, the powers of religious objects, the skills of trained specialists, and time, your time and the time of your children. Use refers to the engagement of resources in human practices. It draws attention to the variety of ends of human activity, which far exceed the emaciated ideal of utility-maximizing economic man. Indeed, the range of human uses goes beyond the human and includes gods, spirits, ancestors, etc. Employed unreflectively, the term use could be a limiting term, privileging utilitarian consumption over the work of creation, cultivation, and relationship. I hope we don't do that. One could perhaps use the word engagement instead, but use has the advantage of reminding us that resources do often get used up. And also, sometimes, as Nima Tashi and Georges Bataille remind us, sometimes needs to be used up. The distinction between a resource and a use is not that simple. Of course, resources are used and maintained with other resources. Decisions, finally, draws attention to choices made individually and as members of collectivities about resource uses and changing social, economic, and cultural landscapes. The need for decision is not restricted to times of great change, although these make these decisions more painful and perhaps bring them more to consciousness. Our attention should be directed not only to what is decided, but to how decisions are come to. It's not a random thing, as Gina said. It's not entirely free. People seek advice. They look for precedents. They cite authorities. They balance authorities. They contest authorities. They seek validation from various sources. They give reasons of various kinds to various stakeholders. So there's a lot of reasons there if we can find the places where they're given. Most resource uses affect others, so decisions about resource uses will inevitably be made in relationships, not all of these harmonious relationships, and not all only with human beings. These relationships can be just as messy as interpersonal human relationships are, and in many ways are intertwined with interpersonal human relationships, with the relationships of different groups. They also involve different kinds of agency than merely the human, and arguably, through ritual, human activities that participate in other forms of causality than those which Western scientific views recognize. The language of decision must be handled with care as well. Many people are excluded from decisions. What strikes us as a decision may not be experienced as such. There are many situations in which initiative is disowned or even disavowed, and yet resources are allocated and reallocated for new and old uses, and these changed or unchanged circumstances sometimes need to be explained to people, even if it is only to explain that they cannot be questioned. And then we want to know how people respond to that claim. Human beings also aren't the only deciders, as dreams and various rituals of divination and augury make clear, and we saw that in one of the photographs from Kathmandu. The life of the everyday has struck many thinkers as intrinsically devoid of awareness of decisions, with religion as its halo. It's the quintessential ideological category in some way. That's where ideology is thought to live, right? It's a little bit too easy to see religion as always on the side of a disempowering and unthinking stasis, as we saw in Gina's remarks about a kind of a dialogical understanding of play as actually a part of the life of a tradition. As ERSEH, who I've mentioned before, says, there is no absolute distinction between freedom and authority in everyday religion. Sometimes it's religious authority which gives individuals the freedom to make decisions. Religious resources and uses frame decisions and can give voice to unexpected decision makers. This model doesn't claim to be exhaustive. You need structural and other analyses as well, but it offers a template for facilitating the analysis and integration of the kinds of case studies we heard about this morning. We might end up replacing these terms. I'm not wedded to them. We might conclude that these terms, even as stretched, are still too utilitarian, or that they fundamentally distort indigenous understandings and experiences of agency. Even these, however, would be very useful insights to offer environmental policymakers on the ground. The resource use decisions framework builds on the recent turn to what is known as lived religion or everyday religion. They're not the same, but I don't have time to distinguish them. The concept of lived religion is a relatively recent arrival in the academic firmament. It hasn't got an orthodoxy or even a dedicated journal. In part, this is because it comes at the confluence of several academic fields. It arose with history's turn to the social and sociology's turn to the cultural. It's been shaped by the discoveries and rediscoveries of women's history, of history from below, and leavened by questions about the nature and future of religion in modern and putatively secularizing societies. The term lived religion suggests a distinction between religion as preached and religion as practiced. It also emphasizes that, contrary to secularization theorists' claims, religion is alive. Indeed, it finds signs of vitality in the very practices and traditions which some advocates and critics of religion have read as signs of decay, engagement with this worldly concerns, and the bricolage, the syncretic reinvention of traditions. Let me focus very quickly on three primary commitments of this approach to the study of religion. First, even as it foregrounds the everyday lives of ordinary people, it's not interested exclusively in them. Unlike some studies devoted to popular or everyday religion, it doesn't imagine that these practices are effectively independent of larger traditions, organized religion as it's often called, that are more commonly studied by scholars of texts and institutions. Everyday practices are informed by and articulated in tension with larger institutions, discourses, power structures. The process is not necessarily an adversarial one, although it can be. As Libaud reminded us, religious specialists have roots in ordinary homes and themselves have everyday lives too. They interpenetrate once you start to look. The study of lived religion regards boundaries like those between official and everyday religion, or organized and everyday religion, or whatever you want to call it, not as false, but as constructed and contested on the ground. We'd really need to know how these things are lived and negotiated. The sacred narratives tend to present religious traditions and institutions as if they emerged from outside of the human world. The lived religion orientation insists on human participation. Or see again, there is no religion that people have not taken up in their hands. We should reject mystifying elite pictures of religion that reify traditions and suggest a fundamental conflict with other elements of life and culture. The lived religion orientation finds instead that hybridity, pastiche, and making do are the constitutive aspects of religion, even in the lives of elites and specialists, and as such are appropriate places to begin discussions of ethics and norms. Second, this will go faster, the study of lived religion is not perplexed or disgusted when it turns out that people engage in religious practices for this worldly benefit, like fertility or exam success. Let's take for granted that religious practices emerge and are maintained or modified because they answer needs, including worldly human needs. It's our mind issue that somehow sees these as some sort of a violation of the purity of religious institutions if we come from certain Western assumptions. Third, the study of lived religion sees syncretism as quite normal and healthy. The mixing and mingling of resources from many traditions is not condemned, but accepted as part of the creative problem solving of life's challenges. This is not to say that any and every cobbling together is of equal value, nor have I suggested that it's undertaken lightly. But it suggests that more and finer lines need to be drawn than the pure versus the mixed. The game changer might be the move from assuming that syncretism is a kind of deviant exception carried out by amateurs, to seeing anti-syncretism, specialization, setting apart purification as the exception that needs to be explained. In fact, I think it's helpful to think about that as the cultivation of a resource. I think a society has an interest in specialized knowledges, has an interest in working out various kinds of resources, so we can actually see anti-syncretism itself as coming out of the same process that's usually expressed in syncretic terms. One could summarize the lived religion orientation as seeing ordinary people as engaged in and making worlds. Religious worlds are not necessarily built in compensation, correction, or refutation of the world of everyday life, although they are what help people stay in worlds, or in traditions, or move among them, as again we heard in the life histories from the Kathmandu Valley. I think I have 2 minutes left. All of this might seem obvious until you see how radically it departs from the assumptions of what I will call the standard view of religion, which I think is more vibrantly alive outside of religious studies than in religious studies. This is a view deeply enmeshed in the categories and structures of the modern world system. I'll focus on those assumptions which the lived religion approach upends. The standard view sees religion as out of the ordinary, if not indeed concerned with renouncing or transcending the everyday world. It thinks of religion as a separate realm of human concern, relating probably to a separate world or a plane of existence or perhaps a level of consciousness that attends other parts of life. It thinks of religion as struggling to make access to this separate world or level of experience available through practices of setting apart, sanctification, purification, always dividing, always dividing. This conception of religion emerged in modern times, and many religious studies people call it Protestants. I don't have time to tell you about Friedrich Schleiermacher's invention of it, but I'll just point out that we, as scholars, often think that the concept was given its new meaning around about 1800, which is about the same time that many other modern inventions happened, including the category of race, the idea of complementary gender, the notion of nation, and if Foucault's to be believed, even the concept of man. So don't think that religion is something that just is always out there waiting for somebody to theorize it. It emerges at a very specific moment in the West at a time when a number of other things, including also the separation of church and state, start to be experienced deeply. So that's what that section's about. For all these reasons, it's not enough quite to say that the standard view is Protestant. Some of the most insightful theorists and critics of religion have been atheists. Thinkers like Feuerbach, Tyler, and Durkheim share with Protestantism, or perhaps with empire, the sense that religion was a process of transcending the local, of transcending the material. It might need to transcend historical religion entirely. Much in the secular social sciences traces to the categories and methods emerging from these debates, including the expectation that religious wisdom and practices will finally be clarified into secular ecological knowledge. It's a little easier to see the Protestant paradigm at work in the category of world religions. Certain religions were given that designation. We can never decide quite what the list is, but we all kind of are told that there are such things. Certain religions are deemed worthy of that designation because they transcend their national religion and this worldly and ritual concerns. Religion here lives in a world of its own, whether in a mountain fastness or, better still, in a moment of pure disembodied individual consciousness. This underlies the scholars' antipathy for non-Protestant forms of Western religion and their fascination specifically with a certain construction of Indian traditions, figured as variously world-rejecting or world-transcending. The world religions paradigm not only privileges but a few traditions, but it favors only certain strands in them. It encourages us to suppose that there is such a thing as an essential Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam, and in so doing, it strengthens those within those traditions who are trying to introduce and enforce that kind of orthodoxy. There are versions of these movements, these purifying fundamentalist movements, afoot in all of the areas I visited in the Himalaya. Lived religion has no investment in the answer to questions like, is this Buddhist? If these are not questions being asked on the ground, and in that case, you'd want to find out what they're really asking about and what the terms are and how it's determined. The standard views, by contrast, are ever worrying that religious traditions are being sidelined, if not indeed corrupted by non-religious concerns. Lived religion, and even more so resource use decisions, doesn't have time for the question, is this religious either, actually? Not again because I think there is nothing there, but because it finds that Western categories of religion don't get us close enough to there to illuminate what's actually going on. Last paragraph. One can summarize the case against the standard view by saying that religion, claiming to be a descriptive category, is really a normative one. Whether used by those who want to protect it or to destroy it, it sees religion in its truest form as otherworldly, striving to represent in consistency and purity an alternative to the supposedly mundane passions and complexities of ordinary human life. The standard view defers to the views of religious elites and authorities in sharing their contempt for this worldly concerns and their horror at mixture syncretism. Yes, it sees ordinary folks in terms, I borrow recently used by Bruno Latour, it sees ordinary people as dupes, cynics, or manipulators. You can see why the study of lived religion is such a challenge to the ordinary view and such a tonic to those of us who wish to reject it. Lived religion asserts the humanity and creativity of all peoples and all traditions within them, while not assuming that religion is always or ever necessarily a good thing. It takes seriously people's decisions about uses and their devotion of resources to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark Larrimore. That was a interesting contrast to the very detailed reports on specific ethnographic contexts of the previous papers. We're going to move on and to a paper by Cameron Tonkinwise from Carnegie Mellon University with the very intriguing title, which seems to take us to the whole crisis of sustainability, entitled, "Must We Mean What We Do When It Comes to Sustainability? What the Himalayas Teach Consumer Capitalists About Material Practices."
So in a strange way, I think I'm going to test this kind of commitment to a syncretic version because of course I'm coming from the field of design. So when projects happen in the new school, it's always important that the 60% of the new school that is the design school somehow manifest. And so I'm that entity. So I'm doing a very strange thing here, and I'm working in a very strange way, and it's a bit of an experiment and slightly confused, and so bear with me. And not least because I'm beginning with Gina's slide. Because in a funny way, I kind of realized that what I'm trying to do at this particular event, in this particular talk, is in a sense flip this. When I saw this particular instruction, I wasn't so interested in the last component of it, which Gina was talking about in terms of nature, but more in terms of whether this was, and this goes to Mark's paper, whether this was about being religious or being ritualistic. And so, in a funny way, I would suggest that I am doing the opposite of this particular sign. That what I'm trying to ask is, in relation to sustainability, and it's the same kind of phrasing as using Stanley Cavell's famous book, Must We Mean What We Say? In the same kind of way, must we actually mean what we do? Do we have to actually kind of mean what we do in relation to when everyday religions coincide with more sustainable approaches to environments? And is that a type of religiosity or is that a type of ritualism? And so in a weird way, I'm going to be very materialistic and rather profane in this particular circumstance. The other thing to say is that, of course, we did talk a bit about the fact that this event is occurring here. Mark began this way, and so I'm speaking very much from this perspective. I've approached this entire research project over the last 3 years when I was extraordinarily generously taken to Kathmandu and to Shangri-La in order to have experiences that you can only ever have at the New School. Incredible kind of mind-stretching, as it's been called. But my attitude has always been, what does this actually teach us about the problem here? And we heard a bit of this last night in reaction to the film. It's all well and good to kind of look at melting glaciers and the ways in which people are coming up with low-cost solutions in that particular space. But the real issue is, of course, let's point the fingers, who's causing it? And so to some extent, I want to get at who's causing it. It's us here. The other thing I quickly want to do, and I did this sort of halfway through the project, was just remind people about multiple discourses of environmentalism which have been kind of occurring already. And this will kind of lead all the way back to design. But I think it's important to remember that environmentalism has kind of moved from something like economic resource protection, merely for ensuring the renewability of a particular resource for its exploitation, to something like nature protection, to something where we actually consider there to be an inherent value in what is in fact extraordinarily valueless land, very inaccessible, which is one of the reasons why it got protected in the first place. So this move from resource protection to nature protection, to some extent a recognition of the modern ecological politics in relation to toxicity and pollution, understanding something about the detailed science and technology of the production mechanisms of late 20th century, which have in fact poisoned a lot of our ecosystems and in fact us as well. To obviously what was cited previously in relation to the Brundtland definition, the kind of moment at which there was a recognition that equity needs to be in this question as well, current equity and future equity. But finally, the space in which I am operating as a design studies academic is very much in, let's say, the Marrakesh moment, at which there is not only supply side, production side, eco-efficiency, a technicist version, but understanding that we need to be thinking about actually changing the ways in which people in very everyday senses practice their consumption. That there needs to be a closing of this loop and that we need demand side and consumption side. And so one of the things I might just quickly do is say, well, how on earth do you do that? How on earth do you get people to change their behaviours? And so, by the way, let me just make a short aside, that one of the things that's been most shocking about this project is that, and we heard this question earlier today about the role of religion actually holding back sustainability. One of the things that has been most shocking to me is that in coming to understand quite religious cultures, people whose everyday lives are strongly are bound up with their religion, showing incredible more flexibility, not only in their practices but also in their beliefs, than secular societies like New York, which have incredible inertia. So in a weird way, the detraditionalization that led to the modernization of what is a late capitalist culture, strangely has more inertia than you see in so-called more traditional societies. So if we are going to get late capitalists to move, what do people do? Well, designers like me think, well, we just need to give them a lot more information. Part of the problem is they just can't see the ecological impacts of what they're doing. You just have to kind of put a lot more information in front of them. But I want you to just think about that for a second, that particular idea that we cannot see the consequences of our actions, which is a very secular version of a quite religious tenet, right? That there are things that you are doing right here and now that have consequences that you can't possibly understand, that a certain set of people are in a position to divine what those consequences are, and their job is to try and bring that back to you, to sermonize, as it were, to use a kind of a Protestant metaphor, every Sunday to bring it back to the way in which you are living in your kitchen. Right? It should be on your phone, in the same way that your phone reminds you that it's time to face Mecca and begin to pray. One might also come and say, it's time you started thinking about reducing your carbon budget right here and now. And of course, this type of information has very limited agency. It's quite technicist, quite instrumental. It's proved not to actually be very successful at all, no matter how beautiful the design is behind the interface, or how clever the interaction, or how great the data set. And so one would then come and say, okay, well, in fact, it's more about other values. Strangely enough, this is one of the leading figures in interaction design, a woman called Brenda Laurel, hugging a tree. But it's just an indication that perhaps the way in which we cause change in our societies is a recovery, a re-enchantment, a returning to some kind of values, a kind of reinvestment in Gaia as a kind of secular religion for the West. There have been a lot of people working in this particular way. And then there are others that I don't have time to go into who kind of bridge between those two, who come along and say, well, in fact, there needs to be some instrumentalism in the way in which Mark was talking about resource use and some connection to higher order values. So very interesting work done by social psychologists in relation to WWF UK on how do you do framing and values, a quite instrumentalist attempt to kind of create artificial ideologies, one might say. And the other quick note that I'm just putting in here, partly to do with discussions that also occurred in relation to the film last night, but also because I think they're important to kind of remember, and they go to Mark's point about the extent to which sustainability is efficiency of resource and all about thrift and a thoroughly Protestant in its secular capitalist version, whether sustainability is about that or whether sustainability is in fact the choice to destroy resources in particular ways. I wouldn't use the word use, I'd almost offer Mark something more like fruition, the kind of the Latin for use, something more like fruit. What is the way in which we want to kind of be fruitful, let's say. And to that extent, I think it's always important to remember, just a very short kind of aside to say, it's important to remember that a lot of the things that we think in the West, in the Northwest, are the most ecologically impacting often aren't, and the things that often are in different spaces of whether we can actually make changes on them easily or not, by, for example, being prompted by an app. So I think it's always important to differentiate where these ecological impacts are in scale and whether they're discretionary or undiscretionary, and very crudely you could just kind of say, well, to some extent, you know, obviously my meat consumption has quite a large ecological impact in terms of climate change, and it's something quite discretionary. It's very easy to modify that. My mobility in terms of the ways in which infrastructures lock us into particular behaviours, much more difficult to kind of negotiate. So I think this is important, and we kind of mentioned electronic products yesterday and story of stuff, and I think it's important to put those into the context, because to some extent I'm going to talk to you briefly about heating and cooling. And the last kind of caveat is to say that designers are starting, design studies is undergoing a similar shift in relation to religious studies, a kind of recovery of a type of materialism inspired by a lot of science and technology studies, a move towards what's called practice, to recognise that a lot of our activities are not discretionary because they get locked into constellations of devices, meanings and skills. And that if one is going to make a change in our society, it's not enough just to put a new device. One has to recognise that you then need to learn the device and actually construct the meanings that go with it. Nor is it enough just to change the meaning. One can be a devotee of Gaia and yet find it extraordinarily difficult to be sustainable in New York City, which nevertheless is quite sustainable because of its infrastructure. Okay, so that was all the preface. I'm now halfway through and I haven't even got to what I actually wanted to start talking to you about. Let me tell you two stories. So two stories very briefly, and extraordinarily reductive and probably horribly wrong. But these are the stories that I kind of heard. So the first will be a story of Shangri-La, of the kind of constitution of Shangri-La in a kind of overdetermined way. A very interesting story of large-scale flooding on the east coast being mapped back to some of the forestry practices in this particular area of Yunnan province, the forbidding of logging, the fact that local governments began competing with each other to see who could ban the most amount of logging in order to win favour, and suddenly the need for a new type of industry in this particular area, a new revenue source, what to do, the kind of catching on to the fact that there is an internal tourism market within China, particularly interested in Buddhism, and therefore creating, as it were, Tibet outside Tibet, and a quite artificial construction of Tibet outside Tibet, and the artificial reconstruction of an old town and the artificial reconstruction of a monastery, and the peopling with it of, let's be slightly controversial and say artificial priests to some extent. And so all of this becomes extraordinarily successful, so successful that we end up with Libo's sewerage problem pouring into the wetland. And so here is a story of kind of overdetermined urbanisation in a particular structure, interfacing with a particular version of religion. And it has a lot of complex kind of layers that I don't have time to go into. But this was my attempt to kind of read the different levels of the shift, and it's somewhat chronological, going down from top to bottom. And then let me compare that to this story. So here is a place in New York City, and the thing I particularly want to alert your attention to are these. So these are window box air conditioners. And one of the things that's interesting to kind of consider is, okay, so why is New York City locked into this particular way of delivering its coolth? And I've deliberately chosen an example here that is somewhat discretionary, somewhat embodied, somewhat a practice. It becomes very difficult to function in New York City over the summer with the hot and the humidity once you've experienced coolth, the opposite of warmth. Once you've experienced coolth, it's very difficult to kind of function without it. So it's what's called a ratchet effect in socio-technical regime change arguments. Okay, so it's interesting to think about this particular phenomenon. It's interesting to think that, in fact, New York City has this particular version of cooling because it has an interesting relationship to its river. In a strange way, New York developed to the scale and density it developed before cooling technologies were developed. And this is an interesting environmental history problem. How do you get this many people to be fed in a hot, humid summer in a city of this size and scale before you have cooling? Well, they did have a type of cooling. They used to go and harvest the ice over the winter from up the Hudson, and then over the summer this was brought down, the Iceman cometh and would put ice in your box. And only for this reason could New York develop to the level it developed in the late 19th century. So it was kind of utterly dependent upon the city, not on the river, not for its water. There is a whole other story about actually drinking water and the fact that you're drinking some of the best drinking water available to any large metropolis ever, and the way that was secured. But literally in terms of cooling, I think is a very interesting thing to think about. And so in a way, we've switched out to artificial cooling, though there is still cooling occurring via the river. This is the site down at Ground Zero, which is still using some of the river water to do some of the pre-cooling, though it has devastating environmental effects on local fish populations. But I think it's very interesting to think about this kind of cooling issue and the way in which New York City has structured itself into this. And it causes very particular local problems, if I can just explain very briefly. These are extraordinarily inefficient machines. They are actually air mixing devices. They don't just move. They're not split regime, which is like you normally get in Southeast Asia, where it's only refrigerant moving between the hole in the wall. This is whole air mixing. It cools the air much cooler than it needs to cause condensation and dehumidification. They need maintenance. They need the grills to be constantly fixed up and cleaned from the dirty city air. Nobody ever does it. Nobody ever takes these out of the side of the building. So it's an extraordinarily inefficient. When I first came to New York, it was stunning to see that this famous metropolis had locked itself into such an extraordinarily polluting, noisy, hideous technology. And it becomes interesting to say, so why? And it's a cause of global problem in relation to global warming. It's a cause of a lot of local environmental issues. New York City has a series of diesel-fired power stations located always in areas of poverty or less political enfranchisement. And so consequently, these people suffer particulate matter falling upon them, high levels of asthma associated with everybody turning on their window box air conditioners over summer. So every time you turn on your window box air conditioner over summer, you're giving asthma to an African-American child in Bronx. Is a good way to think about it. So here are two stories that seem extraordinarily different, extraordinarily incompatible. They seem like they have nothing in particular to draw in common. One seems to be about nature protection and a certain dictatorial type of change, a very top-down change. It involves a religious culture and new types of infrastructures. The other is the opposite. It's an urban environment, socio-technical evolution, everyday practices, very old designs. But in fact, I think if you said, what is the solution in both these cases, one is struggling to say that we as a group, perhaps, and I'm making a big presumption, think that what we actually need is more authenticity. That Shangri-La just needs to be a little more authentic in its treatment of Tibetan Buddhism. That in fact needs to recover the religiosity rather than the kind of Disney-fied version dancing in the street every night. And simultaneously, one would say that New Yorkers need a more authentic relation to the way in which they are delivering this factor like coolth. They might need something, a better understanding of who's being punished by this, a better understanding of their own resource consumption, whether it's Gaian or whether it's just information. They also need to be more authentic, more scientifically authentic. And to that extent, the last thing, which I really don't have time to do, is just to kind of mention that this project has started to make me want to twist these things around. the kind of material practices approach to religious studies, which somewhat interfaces with the lived religion that Mark has been talking to you about, tends to kind of suggest that we need to understand these as two sides of the same, and that in fact they are both using a particular what's called mediation, and I'm drawing here heavily on the work of Bruno Latour, and a kind of recognition that the difference between knowledge and belief is in fact not so different. That what a scientist does in a laboratory, which is Bruno Latour's argument in this text, what a scientist does is make the invisible visible. And that invisible is not visible without the mediation of all these things. They are literally brought to presence, which is the exact symmetry of a religious practice, particularly a religious practice like Tibetan Buddhism that has an extraordinary level of mechanicity in the way in which it manifests. It has an enormous amount of ritual and technology, prayer wheels that are so enormous that they send billions of prayers, though we could question its authenticity in relation to Shangri-La. But also prayers that are being moved by the wind or are being moved mechanically. There is a way in which a certain version of religiosity that Mark criticised would come and say, this is inauthentic. This is precisely something that we need to be worried about. And yet, in some ways, Tibetan Buddhism shows that there is almost the category of authenticity falls away, that there is, in fact, another type of relation, a mediation. And that is not so cryptically strange. It is, in fact, exactly what scientists are doing in relation to global warming. And so in a weird way, I kind of want to end almost with a visual essay. I want to end with just a series of images. And in a way, I'm falling silent because too easily this just becomes a cheap analogy. And what I'm trying to get at is that there is something more than analogy here. And so I will give you evidence of the material culture of New Yorkers' religion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cameron, for a highly creative and engaging comparative paper, and it raises things to yet even a higher level than we have experienced so far. In our final paper on this session, we have Thomas Mathew, who is associated here with the India-China Institute at the New School. He asked me to, for all of you to practice a kind of intellectual ahimsa and treat him well, and I'm sure we will. Dami.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everybody. I have no particular framework to suggest. I just want to raise some issues that I encountered when examining the connection between religion and the environment. Sorry, yeah? Okay. Yeah, now if everyday religion and sustainable environment in the Himalaya is to be more than just a collocation of three terms, they must be shown to exhibit some relationship of meaningful strength and scale. I will look briefly at some attributes of each of them that might be relevant in discussing the relationship between all three of them. Now first, the Himalaya. It consists of three parallel east-west ranges: the northern Himal with the permanent snowline and the Great Peaks, the Mahabharat Hills in the middle, and the Shivalik in the south, which arose from plate tectonic activity. The 2 points here. Because plate tectonic activity is continuing, the Himalaya is geologically active and geomorphologically dynamic. And because it encloses such a huge area, the Himalaya exhibits enormous diversities of natural environment, cultures, and regimes of resource use. I'll return to the second point later when considering some possible empirical regularities in the relationship between everyday religion, the environment, and the Himalaya, after first briefly discussing the first point in relation to some aspects of the environment. The environment is no longer considered a self-regulating homeostatic system tending naturally towards internal stability. It is an open-ended process of continuous change. Both environment and its corollary environmentalism are elastic terms reflecting the complexity of an entire field of systematic investigation. The environment includes but is not limited to processes that happen at all the different scales of ecological interaction, the biosphere, biomes, ecosystems, biotopes, ecotopes, habitats, niches, etc., where biota and abiota interact to produce constantly changing states of periodic stability, and in which even the smallest event becomes a possible variable in potentially modifying its surroundings. When an open-ended idea of the environment is applied to the geologically dynamic Himalaya, we immediately encounter a problem. Absent a permanently stable system with known equilibrium conditions, and absent therefore the necessary coordinates for precise calibration, how is the threshold of sustainability to be precisely discovered? Now, we could look at what the emerging discipline of sustainability science has to offer. Unfortunately, it provides very little other than vague generalizations about fulfilling the needs of the present without compromising the fulfillment of the needs of the future. In effect, the concept has not undergone any rigorous refinement since it first became globally prominent in the 70s and the 80s. There are two issues that seem to me to be important here. There are many internationally formulated conservation interventions, some of them in the Himalaya, whose ostensible rationale is sustainability, even though we do not have a scientifically precise and unanimous idea of sustainability. We do, however, have a notion of unsustainability, elements of which we grasp intuitively in their apparent self-evidence and which can be arrived at in empirical ways. I will return to the second point later, after I discuss the issue of religion. Now, there are some immediate problems that we face when looking at religion. To begin with, it lacks a generally acceptable definition. Some have offered definitions and others have rejected them. Yet we are aware of religiosity in the Himalaya, and we know broadly the differences in the forms of this religiosity. We know from Todd Lewis and others that some parts of the Himalaya came under scripturally recognizable and doctrinally denominated religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. We know from Gregory Grieve and others that inside such obviously organized religion there are barely recognized prosaic forms whose presence is not evident in the ordinary course. We also know that in dispersed communities across the Himalaya, religion is present in everyday ways, but not necessarily as a separate phenomenon, clearly distinguishable from other distinct everyday activities. As a result, everyday religion has less traction than either the Himalaya or the environment, possibly for two reasons. We must consider the possibility that the purely analytical mode of thinking is inadequate to comprehend those realities of the world that cannot be so deftly inserted into the tidy categories in which we are accustomed to organizing data. It is also perhaps possible that the modern secular sensibility has a diminished aptitude for understanding the religious presence in its less obvious manifestations. Nevertheless, we know from numerous studies on traditional ecological knowledge that certain everyday religious practices of the past express certain conceptions of nature and regulated in some instances with different degrees of success the pattern of local resource use. We also know that what may have hitherto gone unrecognized as a religiously mediated relationship with the environment is being undermined by changes in the Himalaya. The everyday reaffirmation of inherited knowledge is futile when the physical and environmental coordinates within which that knowledge was valid are no longer the same. New beliefs are inculcated by new institutions whose relevant coordinates are not the local environment, but modern economy whose effects spread through the mountain communities at different rates and with different effects. I will return to these 2 points after briefly discussing some issues of method. Now, there is no scientifically precise and objective way of deriving a measurable large-scale notion of sustainability in an open-ended, non-teleological idea of the environment as an evolutionary process. We also do not have any precise procedure for titrating the concentration of religion in the changing mental and moral conditions of its ambient culture. How then do we grasp the empirical relationship between some workable notion of sustainable environments and some recognizable form of everyday religion? Perhaps through skillful means. Kausalya Upaya, or skillful means in Mahayana Buddhism, is an existentially contingent way of identifying necessity and the necessary actions necessitated by it. Faced with an uncertain situation, we apply skillful means in a state of awareness of the context. What is the context? To begin with, there are global causes of systemic origin that have effects at the planetary level and other levels below that, including the Himalaya. There are two implications here. The market and the development process, the system of large-scale production and consumption, have assumed such powerful proportions that they transmit their effects, such as climate change, over long distances. The system from which such large-scale effects arise have physically infiltrated and penetrated the Himalaya, incorporating local agents and participants in its extractive processes as contractors, suppliers, and consumers. This modifies prior forms of subsistence and existence at a higher level of acceleration. These points I'll come back to. And I will return here to some points made earlier, namely the diversity of the Himalaya, the intuitive idea of local sustainability, and the religious regulation of resource use patterns and their decreasing efficacy under conditions of modern change. The rate of exposure to global forces and the results arising from it are not uniform across the Himalaya. Given the uneven effects of global forces, it seems more prudent to reduce the scale of cognition in investigating the possible relationships between everyday religion and environmental sustainability. What is this scale? As various studies have pointed out, a panoramic Himalaya-wide scale of observation has led in the past to sweeping generalizations about the degradation of the environment due to irresponsible resource use by illiterate mountain farmers. These generalizations were subsequently refuted by a large number of small-scale studies focused on a watershed, a village or two, or a district. The higher legibility of detail at this scale of observation could enable a more meticulous examination of the maximum possible relationships between variables in a given surrounding and the attendant patterns of causes and effects from which reasonable, locally relevant, comprehensible, negotiable, implementable, and even reversible notions of sustainability can be derived. This involves abandoning the quest for a precise idea of sustainability and to work with a more pragmatic framework in order to estimate the consequences of particular regimes or resource use, and to ascertain whether everyday religion, either as a system of authority or as a framework of meaning, has any place in mediating and managing how people relate to and use the natural world. Now, I have a personal schematic representation for understanding the change that I see in Kathmandu generally, but in some other places in the Himalaya. And in studying this relationship, it's important to keep in mind the different kinds and rates of change in the Himalaya, and this will help to identify areas where older practices survive in ways that they do not in rapidly modernizing urban centers, and could provide comparative frameworks of reference for studying the strength of the religion-resource use relationship. Now, Kathmandu is one point of comparison where the rate of change has been so rapid that the decline of older institutions and patterns are visible and can be monitored almost in real time. Now, here's where I bring in my own personal schematic formulation. I look at these changes as Himalayan, Neo-Himalayan, or post-Himalayan, depending on the way in which these new developments relate to the Himalaya. Now, urban Kathmandu Valley has transformed over time from a Himalayan mode of existence that lived predominantly within the opportunities and limitations imposed by its geographically and culturally Himalayan location and its technological level, within an elaborate religious cosmology that designated the place and use of its natural resources and activities. In the last 100 years or so, the rate of change accelerated, and as new forms of economic activity emerged in the valley, it acquired what may schematically be called Neo-Himalayan and post-Himalayan characteristics that challenged and undermined the prior Himalayan mode of existence. Tourism, the mining of riverbeds, the overharvesting of medicinal plants are instances of the Neo-Himalayan economy. It involves the intensification of Himalayan resource exploitation in a neoliberal market. Many of these do not constitute new activities. They are traditionally Himalayan activities. What is new is the scale of utilization of resources under an altogether new economic system. Others, like tourism, are new activities that belong to a new economy that uses Himalayan resources in new ways. And then there are economic activities and lifestyles that have no specifically Himalayan content or context and are not particularly Himalayan dependent, and these could be considered post-Himalayan. They involve the replication in a Himalayan environment of non-Himalayan characteristics and elements, the proliferation of new architecture using important material which resembles the kind of buildings that are to be found anywhere else in the world, is one instance of the post-Himalayan economy. They are post-Himalayan because they attempt to exist outside Himalayan limitations or aspire to make the Himalayan environment irrelevant to their existence. This is merely a schematic representation of the kind of changes that Himalayan environments are undergoing. They do not represent mutually exclusive, watertight, temporally sequenced analytical categories. The same people could be involved in the economies of all the three categories, and parts of the same activity could involve all three. The Himalayan, the Neo-Himalayan, and the post-Himalayan coexist in an unequal nexus in cities like Kathmandu, since under the present conditions of wealth generation in a highly monetized economy, the new economic activities clearly entice, dominate, and overwhelm the old city and the coordinates of the traditional religious beliefs without destroying them entirely. These distinctly different regimes of resource use could help locate the forms and changes in the relationship between everyday religion, traditional ecological knowledge, the new economy, and the environment in the Himalaya. Thank you.